Have you ever done something, just a small thing, and years later, something else happens, seemingly unrelated, but it leaves you with a chill down your spine? Like it might be karma? Maybe it was a harmless lie, a simple act of kindness, a selfish choice no one saw. But somehow, the universe kept the receipt. No camera, no witness, just you, in that moment. A boy who used to tease stray cats later grew up to lose sight in one eye after a random scratch. A student who mocked his classmate for being poor ended up watching his own son get bullied years later for wearing secondhand clothes. A woman who once helped an old man during a storm had her daughter's life saved decades later by that very man, now a doctor. There seems to be no connection, but something precise is at work. Karma. Some call it religion. Others call it superstition. And for many, it's just one of those things, impossible to explain, but harder to ignore. You may have asked, why do bad things happen to me? I've done nothing wrong. But what if what you planted doesn't always bloom in this lifetime? You don't have to believe. Just live long enough and pay close enough attention, and you'll notice the invisible coins we toss into the universe always seem to roll back, just not always in the form we recognize. In this video, you'll hear real stories shared online, in confessions, diaries, letters, lives that seem disconnected until a strange pattern appears, an invisible hand. A hidden system that mirrors back our actions, sometimes after a day, sometimes after 10 years, sometimes after 3 lifetimes. We're not telling you these stories to scare you, or to convert you, but maybe just to make you pause, to look back at what you've planted, not to feel guilty, but to gently smile and say, so the universe was listening after all. Maybe you once helped someone and never saw them again. Maybe you wronged someone and thought no one would ever know. Maybe you've been nothing but kind, and yet life feels unfair. But what if the rest of your story simply hasn't arrived yet? And when you hear these stories of a father who twisted the truth and was later betrayed in the exact same way, of a woman who stole another's love only to watch it stolen from her, of a man whose cruel words came back to silence him forever, you may begin to see karma isn't punishment. It's a mirror, but a mirror that reflects on delay. What you plant, you reap, but not always right after, and not always in the same field. So, from this moment on, try setting aside ideas like random, unlucky. But what if these simple moments ripple across time, coming back in ways no one could expect? In Buddhism, karma isn't punishment. It's not reward. It's motion, a seed planted by intention, a cause that travels forward until it meets the perfect moment to become an effect. And sometimes that effect arrives quietly. Other times, like thunder. These stories are not here to scare you. They're here to wake you up to the subtle, invisible threads that connect our choices to our lives. Karma never misses. Not because it judges, but because it follows the shape of what we've put into the world. Now, let me take you into real moments where karma walked in without knocking. Part 1. They grew up on the same quiet street, climbed trees, fished in the nearby creek, shared stolen candy from the corner store, and got scolded together. Mason's family struggled. His parents divorced early. His mom worked night shifts at a diner just to feed 2 kids. Ethan had more stability, a small family business, a modest but steady life. And from a young age, people often said he looked destined to go far. But Ethan never saw himself as better than Mason. In fact, he carried a quiet sense of responsibility, as if he'd been given more so he could lift Mason up, too. Someday, if I ever make it big, you're coming with me. After grinding through years of small jobs, online sales, delivery gigs, risky little investments, Ethan finally launched a modest tech startup. It was nothing flashy at first, but it worked. Once he had some cash flow, he didn't call a recruiter. He called Mason. Come work with me. We'll build this together. Mason didn't hesitate. He became the unofficial COO, handling operations, staff, keeping things running. No contracts, no equity agreements, no paper trail. Just 2 childhood friends chasing a dream, trusting that loyalty meant more than signatures. It's between us, Ethan once said with a genuine smile. We don't need to complicate it. And for a while, that was enough. Mason was the backbone. Ethan was the face. Mason managed the messy work behind the scenes while Ethan courted investors, pitched to clients, and slowly stepped into the spotlight. But as the money grew, so did the distance. Media began calling Ethan a young tech visionary. He spoke at conferences. More funding came. And somewhere in all of that, a new version of Ethan started forming, one that dressed better, smiled less, and talked more about leverage than friendship. Then Mason noticed something. He discovered, accidentally, that the real profits were much higher than what Ethan had been sharing with him. When Mason confronted him, Ethan simply shrugged. There are reinvestments, legal fees, tax stuff. You don't have to worry. I'll take care of you for life. For the first time, Mason felt like a child standing outside a locked door, not knowing where the key had gone, or if he ever had one. Soon after, Ethan sold 49% of the company to an international investment fund. It was a massive deal. The tech community buzzed. Mason didn't explode. He didn't sue. He didn't post angry threads online. He just left. No noise. No drama. Just quietly walked out of the company and Ethan's life. Ethan thrived. He bought a home, a Tesla, got married, had a son. Mason took a job with a nonprofit overseas. Quiet life. Honest work. He seemed at peace. Years passed. Ethan's son, Caleb, grew up to be sharp, assertive, business-minded, just like his father. Ethan raised him with one philosophy: seize opportunity. Don't let others take credit for your work. Be the one in control. He never taught Caleb about sharing, or grace, or regret. At 25, Caleb launched his own edtech startup. Ethan funded it, made introductions, mentored him. Caleb succeeded quickly, too quickly. When the company entered its second round of funding, Caleb handed Ethan a folder with a clause that stunned him. Ethan would be removed from the board, downgraded to angel investor with no decision-making power. What the hell is this? I helped you build this. Ethan shouted. Caleb didn't flinch. You invested. I built it. You taught me to take control. That's what I'm doing. It was perfectly legal. No lies. No drama. Just a clean, cold move. Exactly the way Ethan had once pushed Mason out. Ethan opened his old email and sent a short message to Mason. It had been nearly 15 years. Not an apology. Not a defense. Just 4 words. Now I understand everything. Mason never replied. It wasn't some hardened childhood crime. It was more like a feeling, part curiosity, part envy, part dare. Across the street from where he lived was a big white house with tall hedges and a garden that looked like it belonged in a movie. The family who lived there had this beautiful bird in a golden cage, an African gray parrot. It would mimic people's voices, sometimes even call out names like a ghost. Alex didn't have much. His mom worked double shifts, his dad was gone, and dinner was often noodles or nothing. His room had peeling wallpaper and an old plastic fan that clicked every time it turned. So one afternoon, when no one seemed to be home and the garden gate had been left slightly open, he walked in, hands shaking, heart pounding. He opened the cage, wrapped the bird quickly in his hoodie, and ran like hell. He never told anyone, not his friends, not even years later. Living in another city, he had worked hard to build a life far from where he grew up. Now, he was a team lead in a tech company, had a fiancée named Lena, and was in the middle of closing on a mortgage for their first home. Then it happened. A sudden accusation. HR called him in. Someone had reported him for stealing company equipment, 2 high-end laptops that had gone missing after a team retreat. He laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake. He had nothing to hide. He even welcomed the investigation. But then, the evidence showed up. Security footage caught a man wearing clothes similar to his, entering the supply room late at night. The badge skin matched his ID, but Alex swore he hadn't done it. He even offered to take a polygraph. No one cared. The damage was done. He was suspended, then let go. Rumors spread. His fiancée started pulling away. She said she didn't know who he really was anymore. The mortgage approval fell through. It didn't matter how many times he said, "I didn't do it." Because the truth was, it looked like he did. One night, sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by moving boxes he no longer needed, Alex felt this weight pressing on his chest. A question kept echoing in his mind. Why is this happening to me? And that's when it hit him, out of nowhere, like a punch in the gut. The bird, the cage, the guilt he buried. He hadn't thought about it in decades. It wasn't just the act of stealing. It was the choice to hide it, to never make it right, to let the silence grow like mold over the years. He whispered to the dark room, "I took something that wasn't mine and never paid for it. Now, Someone had taken something from him, and the world wouldn't believe his innocence. He never found out who really took the laptops. Maybe someone had framed him. Maybe it was a glitch in the system. Maybe karma doesn't always arrive with answers. It just balances the scales. In the weeks that followed, Alex began visiting bird sanctuaries. Quietly, he volunteered to help clean cages, feed rescued parrots, and repair broken perches. He didn't tell anyone why. He just did it. Sometimes, as a bright feathered bird sat on his shoulder and whistled nonsense into his ear, he wondered if the past had finally caught up with him, or if, somehow, it had released him. Karma doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers with the same voice you once silenced. It's not about punishment. It's about remembrance. About restoring a balance you forgot you tilted. The cage you once opened to take what wasn't yours may become the invisible walls that shape your future. Not out of cruelty, but out of echo. And echoes always find their way home. Part 2. Goodness sometimes returns, but not in the way we think. Story 3. The sandwich that saved a life. New York City. A biting winter afternoon. Daniel. His life was what many would call stable. A modest apartment in Brooklyn, a car he was still paying off, and a relationship that wasn't going anywhere, but hadn't ended yet either. Wrapped in a worn-out blanket. His beard was unkempt, his face weary. He could have been 40, maybe 60, it was hard to tell. But his eyes, they didn't beg. They had stopped expecting anything. Daniel looked down at his food, turkey sandwich and hot soup. He was hungry too. He'd worked late and hadn't eaten since lunch. He hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he sat down, opened the box, and split his meal in half. They ate quietly. The man thanked him, just once. No long story. No guilt. No dramatics. Daniel didn't say much either. Just nodded, ate his half, and walked away. He forgot about it. 10 years later, Daniel was no longer in banking. He now ran a small fintech startup. He was married to Lily, an interior designer. And they had a 3-year-old son, Jamie, curly-haired, sharp-eyed, mischievous like a little monkey. One Sunday morning, Jamie suddenly collapsed during breakfast. His tiny hands clenched. Calm demeanor. Black-rimmed glasses. White coat. No rush, just certainty. "Your son's okay," he said gently. "We stabilized him in time. If you'd arrived 10 minutes later, it could have been a very different outcome." Daniel's body sagged with relief. But then he looked up and froze. Something about the doctor's eyes. That look. That face. The doctor smiled softly. "You may not remember me, but 10 years ago, you shared your lunch with a man on a park bench in Bryant Park. A turkey sandwich. And soup." Daniel's breath caught. It was him. "I was that man." The doctor said. "I'd lost everything. Family, health, myself. That meal, it wasn't just food. It reminded me that I was still human." Daniel couldn't speak. "That night, I checked into a shelter. Got help. Got sober. I went back to medical school." He paused. "Today, I saved your son's life. But really, you saved mine first." A year later, Daniel was invited to speak at a major conference on unexpected ripples of kindness. He gave only one sentence. "A half sandwich won't change the world. But one day, it might save your child's life." Some seeds aren't meant to sprout immediately. They hide beneath the soil, waiting, patiently, for the right sun, the right rain, the right time. And then, when you least expect it, they bloom. You never know how the kindness you give today will come back. But it will. In ways you can't imagine. Through people you may forget. Not for reward. Not because anyone saw you. It gives something back that no logic can explain. Colorado, 2002. It was a quiet winter morning in Boulder. A thin layer of snow covered the sidewalks. Emily, just 8 years old, was walking home from school. In her hand was an unfinished math worksheet, and in her mind, her mother's chocolate cake waiting on the kitchen counter. Then she stopped, near a bus stop wall. Eventually, a kind elderly neighbor took them both to the nearby veterinary clinic. The dog had a microchip. His name was Max. His owner, a man named Richard. "I just thought if I were lost, I'd want someone to help too." Emily forgot the incident quickly, just like children do. 20 years later, 2022, Emily, now a software engineer in Seattle, was driving down the interstate after a long, exhausting meeting. It was raining heavily. Her phone blinked nonstop with unread messages. Her mind elsewhere. She didn't see the truck in front brake suddenly. Her tires skidded on the slick road. She swerved instinctively, hitting the guardrail, dazed and disoriented. Then, a loud knock on her window. A man in his late 50s, graying beard, concerned eyes. "Are you okay? I saw your car spin out. I'm calling for help." He had pulled over into the emergency lane, risking his own safety. He opened the door, gently pulled Emily out. "Don't worry, I used to be a firefighter. I know what to do." He wrapped his jacket around her and stayed by her side until the ambulance came. Inside the ambulance, Emily whispered, "I owe you my life." The man smiled, "No, I just did what anyone should do." A few months later, Emily, now fully recovered, invited the man and his wife for dinner. During the meal, his wife asked, "Do you think you two may have met before?" The man laughed. The man, Richard, went still, then laughed softly, eyes brimming with emotion. 20 years. The universe has a strange memory. Karma, the gentle circle that doesn't rush. When young Emily wrapped her scarf around the trembling dog, she wasn't expecting anything in return. She didn't know whose dog it was. And then, she forgot. But karma doesn't require us to remember. It doesn't come when you feel entitled. It arrives when you're not expecting anything. When you're hurting, vulnerable, in need of kindness. And at that moment, the good you once gave comes back. But not in the form you imagined. Karma isn't a cold system of justice. It's the memory of compassion. A small act. A single moment of selfless care. Sometimes, that's all it takes to shift an entire future. Part 3. When verbal karma hides in words. Story 5. She led a perfectly ordinary life, teaching at the local primary school, attending church regularly, watering her flowers every afternoon. But there was one thing everyone in town knew. If a new rumor had just begun to spread, it most likely came from Mrs. Bell's living room. Margaret never saw speech as something dangerous. For her, telling a story just for fun, adding a few details to make it interesting, or framing something in a slightly negative light was simply a way to spice up life. When a new neighbor moved in, she was the first to offer help, and also the first to spread that he had gone bankrupt before. When a young teacher joined the school, Margaret was quick to whisper that she probably only got the job due to some connection with the principal. She never said anything directly, but always with phrases like, "I'm not sure, but I heard," or "It seems a bit suspicious, doesn't it?" At first, people listened because it was entertaining. Then it became a habit. Then it became suspicion. Over time, trust within the community began to erode. Friendships soured. Families stopped speaking, simply because of a few whispers that Margaret had let slip. But strangely, no one confronted her. After all, she always wore the face of someone who was just concerned. Years passed. Margaret aged, retired from teaching, and began living more quietly. But the habit never left her. Now, Facebook became her new playground. She would share opinions about others through anonymous messages, ambiguous comments, and indirect accusations, still planting invisible thorns in the minds of others. Until one day, the wheel turned. Margaret noticed that people had begun to avoid her. Those who used to listen to her now quietly turned away. She'd call, and no one answered. She'd invite someone for coffee, and they'd claim to be busy. Old neighbors moved away without a word of goodbye. She felt isolated, and couldn't understand why. Then the imagination started. She began to believe that someone was spreading rumors about her, just like she had done to others. She thought someone was out to get her, manipulating the relationships around her. At first, it was just a feeling. But soon, she became certain. She started taking notes, observing, taking photos, sending anonymous letters to the town council accusing her neighbors of poisoning her plants or tracking her movements at night. People grew concerned about her mental health. Some suggested she see a doctor, but she lashed out, convinced they were trying to silence her. Eventually, her son, who had moved far away years ago to escape his mother's toxicity, had to return. He cried when he saw her, but what broke his heart most was the look in her eyes, suspicious and cold. "I know you're one of them," she whispered. Margaret's life slowly collapsed inward. From a woman who once threw words into the wind, she now lived inside a web of her own words, unable to distinguish what was real and what wasn't. The stories she once made up for amusement had become persistent nightmares, ones that robbed her of sleep, peace, and trust. No one was harming her, but no one believed her anymore. Verbal karma, the easiest to plant, the hardest to undo. People often fear actions, doing harm, getting caught, creating bad karma. But few are mindful of words, because they seem harmless, effortless, and often disguised as concern or opinion. Yet karma doesn't need a knife, a stick, or a loud scream. One subtle comment that makes someone lose their job, dignity, or peace of mind is enough to create serious harm. The danger of verbal karma lies in how reasonable it appears. The speaker believes they are just telling the truth, sharing a concern, or voicing a personal opinion. But once words are released, they cannot be taken back. And if someone believes them, those words begin to take form, the form of pain, division, or doubt. They quietly seep into relationships like termites eating away at the wooden beams of a house. By the time you notice, it's already rotten inside. A poisoned arrow cannot compare to a poisoned word. The Buddha once said, "A poisoned arrow can kill one person, but a poisoned word can kill a family or an entire community." Because harmful speech not only wounds others, it pollutes the heart of the speaker. When one becomes used to speaking with malice, distortion, or manipulation, the mind becomes a factory for toxins. And those toxins, sooner or later, will return. No one killed Margaret. No one took revenge. But she slowly died inside isolation and paranoia, haunted by shadows of her own creation. This wasn't a punishment handed down by anyone. It was simply the natural consequence of a mind that had for too long sown doubt. The saddest part? In the end, there was no one left she could speak truthfully to, because she had long since lost their trust. Part 4. Karma makes no distinction, even when you think you're right. Story 6. When righteousness still plants the seeds of karma. In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Perth, Australia, there lived a man named Daniel Moss. Daniel wasn't the impulsive or hot-headed type. He was a fitness coach, passionate about health, sports, and discipline. And he often taught his students to stand up for the weak and to fight for what's right. Throughout his youth, Daniel embodied the silent hero archetype. He once chased down 2 bike thieves, intervened when a drunk man was harassing a woman in a park, and broke up a bullying incident outside the local high school. To his neighbors, Daniel was the kind of person you'd be grateful to live next to, strong, dependable, protective. But it was this very belief in his own righteousness that eventually led him down a path he never expected. One early evening in June, Daniel was returning from the supermarket when he heard shouting coming from a nearby alley behind the bus stop. Alarmed, he pulled over and rushed toward the noise, only to see a young woman being pulled by a large man. She was crying and screaming, "Let me go! Help! He's crazy!" Without a moment's hesitation, Daniel charged forward. He shouted for the man to let go of the girl. The man turned and barked, "Stay out of this. It's none of your damn business." Daniel didn't wait. He punched the man straight in the face, one powerful hook that sent the man sprawling backward, his head hitting a metal dumpster with a loud thud. Everything happened so fast. When the police arrived, Daniel still believed he had done the right thing, until the woman explained that the man was her brother, a former soldier suffering from PTSD. He hadn't harmed her, but was trying to guide her home during one of her panic episodes. Daniel was stunned, and even more so when he found himself facing charges for aggravated assault. The man had suffered a broken jaw and a mild brain injury. In court, the judge acknowledged Daniel's good intentions, but ultimately ruled that the use of physical force was unjustified. Daniel was sentenced to community service and had his coaching license suspended for a year. Afterward, Daniel fell into a mild depression. He couldn't understand it. Why had doing the right thing left him branded like a criminal? He began replaying the footage from the street camera, analyzing his own words, his reactions. Slowly, a deeper realization began to take hold. How many times had he acted on instinct, see wrong, strike fast, without understanding the full context? How many times had his fist spoken before his mind could ask? A year later, Daniel started volunteering at a local community mediation center. He listened to countless stories, domestic disputes, miscommunications between neighbors, mistaken confrontations. He was shocked by how many conflicts began with simple misunderstandings, with someone misreading a situation. He recalled the first time he ever played hero, back in school, when he punched a boy for supposedly bothering his girlfriend. Only later did he learn that the boy had a stutter and was just nervously trying to say hello. Memories began to resurface like ripples across a pond. Today, Daniel no longer believes in the black and white simplicity of right versus wrong. He has stopped seeing himself as a lone warrior of justice. He's learned that actions, no matter how well-intentioned, can still generate karma if they're not guided by wisdom. Karma doesn't concern itself with your motives. It mirrors the impact. And violence, even in defense, still plants the seed of suffering. We often believe we're doing the right thing, especially when standing up for someone else. But can such actions still generate karma? The answer is yes. In the law of cause and effect, there's no clause that excuses harm simply because it was well-meant. Karma doesn't care about your reasoning. It responds to your action. An arrow aimed with pure intent can still strike the wrong target if released in darkness. Good intentions cannot replace mindfulness. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha taught, karma is not born from empty words, but from action. Actions, whether rooted in good or bad intentions, bear fruit according to their own nature. Therefore, doing the right thing isn't just about intention. It requires awareness, wisdom, and compassion. Part 5. Past Life Karma, and the Things We Can't Explain. Story 7. The Boy Who Remembered Who Killed Him. The small town of Rutledge, Tennessee, was so peaceful that people often left their car keys on the seat without a second thought. Everyone knew everyone. Trust was a given. Mystical stories belonged in books and movies, until the birth of Cameron Sullivan. Cameron was the only son of Anna and Michael Sullivan, a perfectly ordinary family, thrilled at how early their son began to speak. But from the very beginning, the things Cameron said left his parents stunned and increasingly frightened. At just 2.5 years old, the boy began telling stories that didn't belong to his life. "My name was Sean," he once said. "I died because of a man in a leather jacket. He stabbed me when I was walking home from work at night. There was so much blood, it was cold. I tried to call for help, but no one heard me." Anna initially dismissed it as childhood imagination or strange dreams. But the details grew more precise and persistent. Cameron could describe a dead-end street in neighboring Jefferson County, one the family had never visited. He spoke of a bar with a skull-shaped sign and a silver ring engraved with the initials DJ, details that seemed absurd until they began to add up. Anna started recording Cameron's stories and took them to the local police. At first, no one took her seriously. But then Officer Paul Jennings, a seasoned detective who had investigated a cold case 16 years prior, heard the name Sean Doherty and froze. Sean had been a bartender, stabbed to death walking home after a shift at a bar. Everything Cameron described matched the case. At the time, the death had been considered a botched robbery. The prime suspect, a co-worker named Dean Josephs, had been released due to lack of evidence. The case had gone cold. There was no logical way a 3-year-old could know such things. But Cameron insisted. He hid the knife under the seat of his car. "I remember. He threw the ring away. He was afraid someone would find it. But my blood is still on it." With the help of a research team from the University of Virginia that specialized in cases of childhood past life memory, the investigation was reopened. Police obtained a warrant to search Dean Joseph's home in Georgia. In a wooden box in the basement, they found a silver ring engraved DJ, just as Cameron described. DNA testing, now far more advanced than it was 16 years ago, confirmed that the dried blood on the ring matched Sean Doherty's. Dean Josephs was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He denied all allegations, but the physical evidence and the strange testimony of a toddler shook the court. The media dubbed the trial one of the most unbelievable reincarnation cases in U.S. legal history. Despite the media frenzy, Cameron's parents kept him away from cameras. "We don't want our son to become a circus act," Anna said. "He's just a child." But clearly, something is happening here, something we can't explain. As Cameron grew older, the memories began to fade. Experts said this was common in children who remembered past lives. Such memories usually vanish by the age of 6 or 7. But for those who had witnessed it, the lesson remained. Karma might not just exist in the mind. It could transcend time, space, and even the boundaries between lifetimes. Karma beyond comprehension, within the scope of modern science. Stories like Cameron's sit at the edge, difficult to prove, but equally hard to dismiss. Buddhism does not encourage superstition. But it doesn't reject the idea of rebirth or karmic consequences carried across lifetimes either. In the world of phenomena, not everything requires linear logic to be real. Nothing is lost, only transformed. In the Majjhima Nikaya, middle-length discourses, the Buddha said, beings wander through sasra like dry leaves in the wind, carried by the force of their karma. A single word, a single action, a betrayal, may be forgotten in one life, but come to fruition in another. Sean's unjust death didn't end in silence. It was unraveled by the very consciousness that had once suffered it, returning, reborn. Story 8. The birthday no one celebrated. Elena Rosenthal was born in the outskirts of Zurich, Switzerland, into a family that never celebrated her birthday. From a young age, she noticed that her birthday was unlike other children's. There were no cakes, no parties, no one even mentioned the date. Her father, Lucas, simply reminded her that it was a day for silence and reflection. At first, little Elena didn't question it. But things began to feel strange when she turned 7. On her 7th birthday, Elena fell down the stairs and suffered a mild head injury. On her 10th birthday, she broke her arm in a bicycle accident. At 13, she was hit by a car on the way to school and needed 6 stitches on her forehead. Every year, without fail, something happened on November 14th, her birthday. Sometimes it was just a bad flu. Other times, it was something serious. Elena began to fear that day as if it were cursed. As she grew older, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe she became anxious every year around that time, throwing her system off balance. She explored psychological explanations, tried meditation, hypnosis therapy, even lit candles in church and prayed, but nothing stopped the pattern. Every November 14th, misfortune returned like clockwork. At 32, Elena decided to face the truth. During a visit to her aging father, now in the early stages of dementia, he repeatedly mumbled a phrase when he saw her. You shouldn't be living in her place, shouldn't be living in your mother's place. Elena froze. She had always been told her mother died of complications after childbirth, but something in the way her father said it felt like there was more. She started digging into hospital records, old family documents, and finally found a newspaper clipping from 1992 in a local archive. Tragic car crash on A3 highway. Pregnant woman dies at scene. Baby delivered by emergency C-section. The woman's name was Clara Rosenthal, her mother. Elena had not been born in a hospital, but in the back of an ambulance, minutes after a truck slammed into their car. Her mother died instantly. She was cut from her mother's body in a frantic race against time. Her birth was soaked in sirens and sorrow. November 14th was not just her birthday. It was the day someone died for her to live. Her entire childhood had been raised in silence and withheld truths. But somehow, her body and mind remembered what was never spoken. Year after year, karma, or something like it, returned not as punishment, but as an echo of an unhealed wound. Elena sought counsel from a Thai monk who was temporarily residing in Europe. After hearing her story, he said simply, "Pain that is not touched will find its way back." He explained that karma is not always retribution. It can also be an invitation to see what was never healed. From then on, Elena changed how she lived. Each year on November 14th, she no longer avoided it. Instead, she held a meditation and prayer for her mother. She sent flowers to the hospital that had once tried to save both lives. Strangely, after that, the accident stopped. The unspoken memory becomes karma. Elena's story is strange, but not rare. Emotional legacies can pass down through silence. A death that is never mourned, a truth never spoken, leaves marks on the next generation. In Buddhism, this isn't called being haunted, but rather the residue of karma. When something hasn't been accepted or seen, it returns in different forms. Karma doesn't need your belief. It only asks to be seen. And once it's seen, it can be stopped. One poisoned arrow is not as deadly as an unhealed memory. The Buddha once said, the first arrow is inevitable, but the second is fired by yourself. Elena's birth was the first arrow. No one chose that tragedy. But the silence that followed for 30 years? That was the second arrow. To heal karma doesn't always mean to do something grand. Sometimes, it's just one person turning around, looking at what was hidden, and sitting quietly with it. Part 6. The Law of Karma at Work. No one cheats the system. Story 9. The Executive and the Numbers That Lied. Michael Thornton was a business executive forged in the golden age of 1980s America. Born and raised in a modest suburb of Milwaukee, he came from a middle-class background that offered few privileges. Through relentless hard work and sharp intellect, Michael climbed his way up the ranks of the early software industry. By the age of 38, he had founded his own company, Thornton Systems, offering enterprise management software to small and mid-sized firms across the U.S. His company never made Wall Street headlines. Michael knew how to adjust the numbers, inflating earnings, deferring expenses, recognizing revenue prematurely, and restructuring deals when necessary. At first, these actions were subtle, even arguably legal, just financial optimization. But as the company grew, so did the pressure from investors. Michael crossed the line. He began hiding income, fabricating contracts, and setting up shell companies to shift profits out of view. "I'm not doing this for me," he told his wife one evening. "I'm doing this to keep the company alive, for the jobs, for the legacy, for our future." He saw himself as pragmatic, not corrupt. He didn't embezzle for yachts or parties. Everything was for strategy, and he believed the system could be outwitted if you were clever enough. By 65, Michael was ready to retire. Thornton Systems had nearly 300 employees and consistent revenue. He stepped down and moved to a lakeside home in Michigan with his wife. Their only son, David Thornton, had just secured a high-profile position as a financial advisor at a major investment firm. Michael was proud of David. His son was following the exact path he'd envisioned: top schools, top firms, and a sharp financial mind. Michael had even passed down some of his carefully concealed wealth to David, assets buried in complex offshore structures, anonymous real estate holdings, and legacy shares held under different names. But then, it all unraveled. 1 year into Michael's retirement, David was investigated for tax fraud and falsifying financial records. At first, Michael assumed it was a mistake. David wasn't reckless. But as the probe deepened, investigators uncovered significant undeclared assets tied to David's name, many of which traced back to shell companies Michael had used in his corporate years. When questioned, David was stunned. He didn't fully understand where the funds came from. His father had handled everything. The indictment followed swiftly. It became a high-profile case across financial media. News anchors debated how a rising star like David could fall so hard. The public was divided. Some blamed generational corruption, others called it tragic irony. Michael, now secluded from public life, watched in silence. The tragedy wasn't sudden. It was a slow chain of karma disguised as cleverness. Michael had always believed he was just smart with numbers, not unethical. That seed didn't just grow in his lifetime. It grew in his sons. David, though never intentionally deceitful, was entangled in the financial web his father had spun. He couldn't tell where the clean money ended and the manipulated wealth began. And the system, the one Michael thought he had gamed, struck back where it hurt most: his family. Karma doesn't care about your defense. It mirrors your deed. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches, not in the sky, nor in the middle of the sea, nor by entering into mountain clefts. Nowhere in the world can one escape the result of evil action. Michael wasn't arrested. He wasn't publicly humiliated. But he lost something more haunting: peace of mind. He watched his son bear the consequence of choices he thought he had buried and cleaned up decades earlier. You can escape regulatory audits, but not karmic ones. Karma doesn't care if you were well-meaning. It doesn't measure intent. It mirrors impact. And when the time comes, it knocks on your door. Not a second too soon. Not a second too late. In business, truth is the only asset that never depreciates. You might not get caught today. You might finesse your way through the loopholes. But if the price is your inner peace, your integrity, or your loved ones, was it worth it? Systems built by humans can be fooled for a time. But the karmic system? That one never misses. Story 10. The Oppressed and the Oppressor, when karma doesn't need to be enforced. New Jersey, early 1990s. Evelyn Carter had just joined a regional office of a major insurance company. As a Black woman who had overcome countless obstacles to earn her college degree, Evelyn understood that to survive and advance in the corporate world, talent alone wasn't enough. She needed to be twice as patient, twice as disciplined. Evelyn was quiet. She showed up on time, stayed late, delivered projects ahead of deadline, and volunteered for tasks others shunned. But in the politics of the workplace, people like Evelyn weren't always admired. In fact, her work ethic made others uncomfortable. Her direct manager, Richard Feldman, a white man in his 40s who'd been with the company for over a decade, saw Evelyn not as a promising professional, but as a threat. Every time Evelyn was praised in a meeting, Richard would redirect the conversation or subtly discredit her. During performance reviews, despite her measurable results, she received only average ratings. No one in the office stood up for her. Some stayed silent out of fear. Others had simply grown used to the system. 20 years passed. Evelyn kept going, quietly, steadily. She left the company after 6 years, joined a small startup, then moved to a multinational financial firm that recognized her capabilities. Slowly but surely, she climbed the ladder. First manager, then director, then eventually board member. Her success didn't come in a dramatic, Hollywood fashion. It came through years of unrecognized effort, like seeds growing roots beneath the surface, invisible but anchoring something strong. Sitting in the back row that day was a tired-looking, silver-haired man, Richard Feldman. Life hadn't gone the way he expected. After Evelyn left the company, Richard stayed, but soon after, an anonymous complaint accused him of discrimination and favoritism. The company didn't act immediately, but from that moment on, his career stalled. No more promotions. He was transferred to an irrelevant department. Eventually, he was forced into early retirement. No one called him back as a consultant. No one spoke of him as a mentor. The very people he once silenced had moved on, many further than he had ever gone. And there he was, in that room, watching the woman he once held back stand on stage, being respected, being heard. No one punished him. No law came for him. But the silence around him was karma speaking loudest. Karma doesn't always arrive in dramatic punishment. It often arrives through irrelevance. Richard wasn't sued. He wasn't shamed. He was simply forgotten, left behind by a world that had moved past his behavior. Deep down, he knew it was fair. And Evelyn, she didn't seek revenge. She didn't post exposés. She just lived, true to her values, and let the system take care of the rest. A sharp word leaves a deeper wound than a sharp arrow. Through quiet hostility, you're planting a path, one that no one can take from you. Because it doesn't lead to temporary success, it leads to lasting freedom. Freedom from bitterness, from revenge, and from the endless loops of negative karma. Part 7. Karma in Love, Who We Attract, and the Energy We Bring. Story 11. The Other Woman, the Best Friend, and the Wheel That Never Forgets. Chicago, 2006. Samantha Cole was 22, newly graduated, and working her first real job at a boutique marketing firm downtown. She was smart, attractive, full of ambition, and no stranger to bending lines when it served her. That year, she met David. He was charming, successful, 10 years older, and very much married. She told herself it was just dinner. Then, just a weekend trip. Then, just until he figured things out. But David never figured things out. Not really. His wife suspected, cried, begged. Samantha knew, and she stayed. For 2 years. When it finally ended, Samantha didn't leave because of guilt. She left because David chose comfort over change. He went back to his wife, with nothing left behind but a handful of missed calls and a name she'd never say aloud again. And Samantha? She moved on. And, for a time, it seemed the world did too. Years passed. Samantha married a man named Mark, stable, kind, a software developer with little drama and no ex-wife in the shadows. They built a cozy life in a leafy suburb, had a daughter. Mark coming home with stories about how Nicole's been helping him with his marathon training, but forgetting to mention that she'd been texting him at midnight. Samantha didn't want to believe it. Until the Sunday morning when her daughter asked, "Is Daddy coming home today?" And there was no reason, just an echo in her chest where certainty used to be. Mark moved out. No fights, no screams. Just an admission. I didn't plan this. It just happened. Nicole understands me in ways I didn't know I needed. Samantha sat alone that night. The same wine glass. The same couch. But a very different version of herself. She looked back, not in self-pity, but in clarity. The pieces came together. The phone calls she once answered that weren't meant for her. She had entered love through a doorway she pried open with someone else's sorrow. And now, someone had done the same to her. not out of vengeance, but because some circles never break. They simply wait. There's a teaching in Buddhist philosophy. One who walks into a house with muddy feet will find the floor dirty, even if the home was clean. It doesn't mean the person is bad. It doesn't mean they deserve punishment. It only means the mud has to go somewhere. Samantha had carried hers for years, without knowing. But something changed after the heartbreak. She didn't spiral. She didn't chase revenge or gossip or public validation. Instead, she paused. She began therapy. Read books, not about men, but about accountability. She started volunteering at a local shelter for women navigating divorce, offering quiet support with no need for heroism. And slowly, something softened. She began to understand. Karma isn't about getting what you deserve. It's about meeting yourself at every turn you once created, and being given, over and over, the chance to choose again. 3 years later, she saw Nicole again, not in a dramatic showdown, but at a grocery store. Their carts collided near the apples. Nicole looked older, eyes tired, hair pulled back. Mark wasn't with her. She muttered a greeting. Samantha smiled, nodded, and walked past. There was no weight, no anger, just peace. Love born from someone else's pain is never free. But healing begins when we stop pretending the cost doesn't exist. It's easy to justify our actions when we're the one choosing. Harder when we're on the receiving end. But karma isn't about blame, it's about return. And it returns not to punish, but to teach. When you enter love with an open hand and clear conscience, it grows. When you enter holding something stolen, even unknowingly, it slips. Always. The law of karma is not a law of vengeance, said the Buddha. It is a law of understanding. And once Samantha understood, the loop didn't need to repeat. It was already complete. Story 11. The man who was always left, until love truly tested him. New York, 2010. Ethan Turner was the kind of man any mother would want her daughter to date. Gentle, sincere, a successful interior designer, animal lover, and a non-smoker. But somehow, he always ended up being the one left behind. His first girlfriend left because she said the relationship lacked intensity. The second said he was too stable, like a cozy couch, but not the kind that makes your heart race. The third, she simply went back to her ex. Ethan wasn't the type to blame others. But every time he was left, he asked himself, am I loving the wrong way, or just loving the wrong people? By the time he turned 34, Ethan was tired. He stopped looking for love on dating apps. Instead, he poured his energy into work, adopted a cat named Marlo, and cooked himself decent dinners in a quiet apartment. Then, during a work trip to Seattle, he met Naomi, a colleague from another branch. Naomi wasn't dazzling at first glance, but she had a way of listening that made people want to speak from the heart. She didn't ask about hobbies. She asked Ethan what had made him saddest that year. They talked like old friends. And when the week ended, something gentle had begun to spark. A few months later, Naomi moved to New York, not for Ethan, but for her own job. Still, her presence brought a quiet light into Ethan's world. They began to date. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't rushed. It was steady. It was kind. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel he had to earn someone's love. He was simply loved for who he was. But then, the test came. In their second year together, Naomi was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. The location, however, made it extremely risky to operate. The surgery might save her, or erase her memory entirely. Naomi chose not to undergo surgery right away. Instead, she lived each day fully, with quiet awareness and unspoken fear. Ethan could have walked away. No one would blame him. But he stayed. He took Naomi to MRI scans. He walked her through parks every weekend. He kept a journal of her favorite things. In case one day you forget, I'll remind you. He didn't make grand speeches. He just stayed. When someone asked him, aren't you afraid? What if she forgets who you are? Ethan smiled. If she forgets, I'll fall in love with her all over again. A year later, Naomi was offered a new, less risky surgical option. The surgery was a success. No memory was lost. No person disappeared. But one love was quietly, deeply confirmed. Years later, Ethan was interviewed on a podcast about people who love with resilience. He said just one thing that made the entire studio fall silent. I used to be left because I wasn't dramatic enough. Turns out, real love doesn't need drama. It just needs to stay when everything else wants to run. Love isn't about being loved. It's about how we choose to love, even when the other person might not be able to love us back. Some people go through heartbreak after heartbreak, not because they're unlucky, but because life is preparing them to become the kind of person who can hold a love that's worth keeping. And when that person finally arrives, the real test is not in proving yourself, but in remaining steady when life shakes everything else. As the Buddha once said in the Dhammapada, the mind is a wanderer, but the mindful one anchors it. Even when the winds of karma blow, they are not swayed. Ethan was no saint, but in the way he loved Naomi, there was something close to awakening. To love without demanding, to stay without clinging, to give without fear of loss. That, more than anything, is what brought love back to him. Part 8. Endings that don't look like fairy tales, but are still just. Story 11. The man who helped a homeless person for a year, only to be betrayed. Yet, karma found its way back to where it was needed. New Jersey, 2005. Mark Ellison was a manager at a small electronics store in a quiet suburban town. He wasn't wealthy, and he didn't consider himself a hero. But he had a habit. Every morning before work, he would stop by a nearby park and hand a coffee and sandwich to a homeless man named Greg. Greg was in his late 40s, disheveled and quiet. But he always accepted the food with both hands and bowed his head in thanks. At first, it was just breakfast. Then it became a routine. Then came winter, and Mark brought Greg a coat. Then came the flu, and Mark took him to a free clinic. A whole year passed this way. Mark never saw himself as a savior. He simply thought, if I ever end up like that, I'd want someone to do the same for me. Then, one day, Greg vanished. No warning. No goodbye. Just gone. Mark was a little shaken, but figured maybe Greg found a shelter or caught a break. 1 year later, Mark would learn the truth, in the worst possible way. A quiet scandal broke in town. Police launched an investigation into a string of credit card fraud incidents. The data linked back to a device, a laptop that had been accessed from inside Mark's warehouse. A laptop Greg had borrowed several times with Mark's permission, thinking nothing of it. Greg had been part of a fraud operation and used Mark's kindness as cover. Everything Mark had done to help now became part of the evidence against him, though he was eventually cleared. The months of legal stress cost Mark his job, his savings, and, worst of all, his belief in helping people. Mark disappeared from that chapter of his life. He moved cities, changed his name on social media, stopped being the good guy. No more sandwiches. No more helping strangers. He married, had a son, Aiden. Life eventually settled, though Mark was never quite the same. 10 years later, a twist of fate. Aiden, now 12, suffered a serious accident while skateboarding. An ambulance was on the way, but the first person to reach him was a passerby, Louise Campbell, a retired pediatric doctor still licensed for emergencies. Louise stopped the bleeding, stabilized Aiden, and kept him awake until paramedics arrived. Doctors later said Louise's actions likely saved Aiden's life. The following week, Mark tracked Louise down to thank him personally. Over coffee, he asked, "Why did you stop to help?" Most people would have just called 911 and kept walking. Louise smiled. "I guess. I remembered someone. A man I once knew, Greg. He was homeless. He told me about a stranger who gave him food every morning, helped him with no strings attached. Greg passed away years ago, but his story stuck with me. I always thought, if I could help someone one day, maybe that would be my way of continuing that kindness." Mark froze. He didn't say a word, didn't mention who he was. He just sat there, coffee trembling in his hand. Some karma doesn't return through the place you planted it, but always finds its way back to where it's needed. A quiet whisper from the Dharma. When you plant a seed, you don't control where or how it grows. But if it's a good seed, it will grow, and someday, it will return to you or to someone you love. Mark no longer saw life in black and white, but neither did he hold bitterness anymore, because now he understood. Kindness isn't a trade. It's a current, one that keeps flowing, even when we're no longer around. Part 9. The karma within families, when even blood bonds offer no exemption. Story 12. When a mother doesn't know how to love. In a quiet town on the outskirts of Manchester, England, lived a woman named Margaret. She was the kind of woman who carried herself with strength and independence, but also with a noticeable coldness. Margaret had once been a secondary school teacher. Disciplined, composed, and rarely expressive. She had a son, Samuel, her only child, and she firmly believed he should learn to be self-reliant from an early age. Samuel grew up in a house where material needs were never a concern, but warmth was. He couldn't remember the last time his mother had hugged him. Birthdays usually passed with a store-bought cake and a curt happy birthday. When he was sad, she would say, "Life isn't easy, don't be weak." And when he failed at something, she'd respond, "You brought this on yourself. Learn from it." As he got older, the gap between mother and son widened. Samuel tried everything to win her approval. Whether it was straight A's or a scholarship to university, Margaret responded with little more than a nod or the phrase, "Good, but you can do better." At 18, Samuel left for university in London and never looked back. He rarely called. Their conversations, already sparse, eventually dwindled to silence. Margaret, true to form, never showed any sign that it affected her. Years passed. Samuel established a career, married, and had 2 children. Meanwhile, Margaret had retired. Old age crept in gently, but not kindly. Her health declined, and she found herself increasingly alone. Her husband had died early, and her siblings lived far away. Neighbors would go weeks without seeing her. One cold winter morning, Margaret slipped and broke her hip. It was the mail carrier who found her and called emergency services. After a hospital stay, she was transferred to a nursing home, a place many elderly people ended up when there was no one left to care for them. Samuel did visit her, a few times at the beginning, but the visits were awkward. They sat across from each other, speaking only of health and weather. The emotional distance, built over years, remained untouched. And soon, Samuel stopped coming. Margaret began to spend her days alone by the window, watching the garden. Other residents were frequently visited by their children and grandchildren, bringing flowers, laughter, and light. She watched from afar, silently, expressionless as always, but something inside her stirred. At first, she convinced herself, "Samuel must be busy. I don't want to bother him." But over time, a deeper truth emerged. This was the very ending she had shaped with her own hands. All those years of being a mother without learning how to show love had become an invisible wall between them. She had thought her discipline would make Samuel stronger. But discipline without tenderness becomes distance. She thought she was teaching him to be tough. But what she really taught him was how to live without emotional connection. And now, he was doing exactly that, with her. One evening, the nursing home held a story circle. Residents were invited to share memories. Margaret, usually silent, surprised everyone by speaking up. She spoke of her youth, of the boy she never truly learned to love. She admitted that if she could go back in time, she would hug him more, praise him more, and say, "I love you," far sooner than she ever did, if ever at all. The room was silent. Many saw their own reflections in her story. No one judged her, but everyone understood. Family karma is one of the most enduring and subtle. It doesn't come from isolated incidents, but from countless choices made daily, through words, gestures, and the times we stayed silent when we should have embraced. There's a saying in Buddhist teachings: a person who never learns how to love within the home will carry the wounds of that absence throughout their life. But there is another. The moment you become aware of your karma is the moment you begin to break free from it. No one is born knowing how to be a parent, but the moment we choose to bring a life into this world, it becomes a sacred responsibility, one that comes with karmic weight. If we are not mindful, we end up passing down the same pain we once received, embedding it in the next generation. Perhaps Margaret would not have the chance to undo her past, but in her realization, a new seed had been planted, not necessarily for herself, but for a future cycle in which she might finally learn what love truly means from the very beginning. Story 13. The Whiplash of Harm. When pain returns through your own bloodline. In the quiet suburbs of Denver, Colorado, lived a man named Richard Holloway. A successful businessman in the eyes of the world, always well-dressed, living in a spacious house. No one would have suspected the shadows that followed him. Shadows that he himself had cast, and now could no longer escape. Richard was the only child of Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, a working-class Irish-American couple. They weren't wealthy, but they gave everything they could to raise their son with love and decency. Yet their efforts seemed to slip through the cracks of Richard's hardened heart. By the time he reached adolescence, Richard had become increasingly violent. Not just rebellious, but destructive. He'd punch holes in walls, throw furniture, yell until the neighbors heard, and sometimes, in the dark corners of their modest home, he'd strike his parents. Some blamed teenage hormones. Others cited poverty or bad influence. But the truth was, Richard had made his own choice to respond to discomfort with cruelty. His parents, out of unconditional love, endured it all in silence. They hid the bruises, made excuses, and told themselves, "He'll grow out of it." But he never did. At 20, Richard's father died suddenly of a stroke. His mother, emotionally broken, moved into a nursing home and quietly withdrew from the world. She never spoke of her son again. Years passed. Richard seemed to stabilize. He married, built a company, amassed wealth and reputation. Outsiders thought he had turned his life around. Then came his son, Daniel. Daniel, as a baby, was bright and adorable. But as he grew, Richard noticed something unsettling in his eyes, something disturbingly familiar. It wasn't mere stubbornness. It was a cold, distant stare, a refusal to connect. Daniel was uncooperative, defiant. When scolded, he didn't cry, he smirked. At age 10, he was suspended from school for hurting another student. And once, in a rage, he even pushed his own mother to the ground. In that moment, Richard saw himself, not as the man he became, but as the boy he once was. Except this time, he was the one being harmed. Richard's wife couldn't take it anymore. She divorced him and took their younger daughter. Richard was left with Daniel, the boy he had once proudly believed inherited his strength. Now, that so-called strength had become a curse. He tried therapy. During one session, the counselor asked, "Why do you think your son is behaving this way?" Richard was silent. The counselor pressed gently. "Often, violent behavior in children is a reflection of unhealed trauma. Were you ever a traumatized child?" That question broke something inside him. He remembered the weary eyes of his mother, the trembling hands of his father after one of his outbursts, memories long buried under the mask of adulthood. He had thought time had erased his sins. But karma doesn't erase. It waits and reshapes. In Buddhist teachings, there is a saying, "One arrow laced with poison is less harmful than one word laced with hate." Richard finally understood. He couldn't blame Daniel, because Daniel was only mirroring a legacy of unresolved pain, a karmic loop that Richard had started. When he chose control over compassion, anger over understanding, he didn't just damage his parents. He forfeited his own capacity for fatherhood. Like a karmic mirror, you cannot punch it without bleeding yourself. After that session, Richard made a decision he had avoided his entire adult life. He visited his mother in the nursing home. She was still alive, frail and quiet, but her eyes recognized him. Richard knelt beside her bed, tears streaming down his face. He didn't offer explanations. He simply said, "I'm sorry, Mom." It wasn't a miracle that healed everything overnight. Often through those we're closest to. Richard's story is not meant to shame, but to awaken. If you were once hurt in your family, don't use that pain as a reason to hurt others. Because karma doesn't skip anyone, not fathers, not sons, not even you. Part 10. Karma and the Invisible Contracts, when even a thought becomes action. Story 14. The Unspoken Curse, when the mind becomes the deed. In a quiet coastal town in southern England, where the morning fog often settles softly over the rooftops of old Victorian homes, lived a woman named Isabel Hartley. She was an art teacher at a small secondary school, leading a peaceful life, admired by her students for her calm and gentle nature. But no one around her knew that Isabel carried a shadow, not of something she had done with her hands or words, but something she had once wished upon someone else. 15 years ago, while studying at university in London, Isabel fell in love with a young man named Adrian. Their love felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, tender, poetic, and seemingly unbreakable. But life rarely lets beautiful things remain untouched. One winter night, Adrian left. No warning, no explanation, no goodbye, just a brief text message. "I'm sorry. We're no longer right for each other." And then, silence. He vanished. No one knew where he went. No closure. No return. Isabel fell apart. Her first love had not just ended, it had disappeared. He didn't ask her about her past. But seeing a quiet sorrow in her eyes, he gently said, "When you light a fire of anger in your heart, even if it burns no one else, it still burns within you first." That night, as she sat in a small meditation hall under the stars, Isabel remembered exactly what she had once wished 15 years ago. He will never be happy. She had never spoken it aloud. Time and again, collapsed at her doorstep. The Buddha once taught, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become." If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows like the cart wheel that follows the ox's hoof. In Isabel's case, karma didn't come through any visible act. It was born in a single, potent thought, one laced with hurt, vengeance, and longing for justice. She had unknowingly created an invisible contract, an energetic thread between her and the man who hurt her, pulling her back every time she tried to move forward. And every time she tried to love again, that unresolved energy whispered, "Not yet." After that trip, Isabel began her quiet return. They returned not as punishment, but as a mirror, to teach us, to awaken us, to remind us that what we wish for others becomes the world we live in first. The invisible vow, when pride becomes chains. In the quiet countryside of Northern Ireland, where rolling green hills stretch endlessly to the horizon, there lived a man named Edward Brennan. He led a simple life in a small wooden cabin outside the town of Donegal. The locals knew him as a skilled carpenter, quiet and always working alone. No one was truly close to Edward. He never married, had no immediate family, and hardly ever asked for help. To most, he seemed like a man of discipline, self-reliant and principled. But few knew that behind his stoic independence lay a vow, spoken not aloud, but etched deeply into his heart. A vow so profound that it shaped the course of his life. Edward had a rough childhood. His father, an alcoholic with a violent temper, would often lash out at the family during his drunken rages. His mother died young, and Edward grew up in an environment of pain, where affection was replaced by control and silence. One night, after being beaten for accidentally dropping a cup, Edward lay on the wooden floor, staring at the cracked ceiling, and whispered silently to himself, "From now on, I'll never need anyone. No one will ever have the power to hurt me again." He thought he was simply protecting himself. But that thought wasn't just a passing emotion. It was a contract of the soul, an invisible vow signed not with ink, but with resolve, pain, and the deep desire never to be vulnerable again. Years passed. Edward honored his vow with unwavering commitment. He never borrowed money. When sick, he treated himself. When others offered help, he refused kindly but firmly. His belief was simple. If I don't need anyone, I owe no one. If I need no one, no one can hurt me. But by stepping out of the circle of human exchange, of giving and receiving, he unknowingly stepped out of the natural current of compassionate karma. Then one winter, when Edward was 64, fate struck. While cutting trees in the forest, a large branch unexpectedly fell and pinned his leg. Though conscious, his leg was trapped. His phone had fallen out of reach, and the remote forest offered no passers-by. In the cold, Edward shouted for help. The forest echoed back. The man who once said he needed no one now lay helpless, immobile, freezing, in pain. He waited. 1 hour. 2. Then an entire day. No one came. 3 days passed. Edward was still alive, barely. In delirium, he began to whisper something he'd never said in decades. "I'm sorry. If someone could help me, I won't turn them away again." Still, no one came. On the 4th day, a group of students hiking nearby stumbled upon him and called for help. Edward survived, but he lost one leg. When he woke up in the hospital, the first thing he asked wasn't about his health, but, "Why did no one come?" An elderly nurse gently replied, "Some neighbors said they didn't hear anything. Most people figured you didn't need help. You never do. People have gotten used to it." In that moment, Edward realized he wasn't abandoned by the world. He was abandoned by his own vow. His inner promise, "I don't need anyone," had become a signal broadcast into the universe. And the universe, obeying the law of karma, responded faithfully, "As you wish." In Buddhist teachings, the Buddha once said, "Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought. If with an impure mind one speaks or acts, Suffering follows as the cartwheel follows the foot of the ox. Karma doesn't only arise from visible actions, it begins in the mind, especially thoughts powered by pride, fear, or isolation. A silent vow, especially one made in pain, carries the full weight of intention, and intention is karma. After that day, Edward changed. He was no longer the closed-off man from before. He accepted help, even if it was just someone offering to carry a heavy plank. He spoke with neighbors. He opened his doors to younger people wanting to learn carpentry. And strangely, his life, once barren and cold like that forest, began to warm. Karma is not punishment. It is reflection. It is the echo of what we think, do, and believe. If you declare something with your whole heart, especially in anger or sorrow, the universe listens, and it responds not with judgment. That vow might be the very chain that isolates you from the love you're still secretly longing for. Let your thoughts be kind. Let your inner promises be open. Because even a whisper inside the heart can shape the path ahead. And sometimes, it's not the world that needs to change. It's the quiet contracts we made with ourselves. Part 11. Accumulated karma. When something keeps repeating and we don't know why. Story 16. The Abandoned One. A Journey Inward. In a quiet town on the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland, lived a man named Callum Fraser. He was a photographer, his eyes always searching the world for beauty, whether in the fading corners of a flower, the shadows of city streets, or the brokenness of a human face. But his inner world was blurry, like a camera lens out of focus, and nothing confused him more than love. By the time he turned 38, Callum had gone through 5 serious relationships, and all 5 ended the same way: betrayal. The first, Freya, left him for a close friend. The second and third also unraveled in threads of lies and unspoken truths. And most recently, Ava, a woman he had truly believed was the one, disappeared with only a short text and an engagement ring that was never worn. Callum began asking himself, is there something wrong with me? Or is love simply a luxury I'm not meant for? With each heartbreak, he didn't just lose someone. He lost a piece of trust, not only in others, but in himself. The repeating pattern began to feel too exact, too cruel, too cyclical to be random. In his desperation, he turned to meditation, not out of faith, but as someone who had lost their way and was reaching out into the dark, hoping for light. A journey into the self. At first, meditation was just a pause, an escape from thinking too much. But slowly, as his practice deepened, strange images began surfacing. Recurring dreams. He saw himself, not as Callum, but as another man in a distant era, perhaps the 18th century, dressed in aristocratic clothing, walking away from a stone manor by a misty lake. In these dreams, a woman wept behind him, his wife. And by his side was another woman he had chosen to leave with, turning his back on everything without a trace of remorse. Callum dismissed these visions at first as the mind's drama, shaped by grief and longing. But the dreams persisted, and over time, the faces became clearer. The sorrow in the woman's eyes began to haunt him even in waking hours. Her name was Eleanor, and the man, though wearing a different face, was unmistakably him. One day, in a deep meditative state, Callum slipped beyond mere visualization. He relived the scene, not as an observer, but as the one who had caused the heartbreak. He felt her sorrow, her disbelief, her silent prayers that he might stay. He remembered believing, with arrogant certainty, that he deserved someone better. That love was something owed to him, not something he needed to protect. It wasn't a vision. It was a scar being reopened. For the first time in his life, Callum cried, not because of what had been done to him, but because of what he had once done to someone else. Karma doesn't always arrive in a way we understand. That moment marked the turning point. He no longer saw his heartbreaks as isolated accidents. He began to see the patterns, not just in being betrayed, but in how he reacted, withdrawing emotionally, becoming cold, unconsciously punishing others for the wounds he hadn't named. He realized karma wasn't punishing him. It was repeating a lesson. During a silent tea ceremony at a Buddhist monastery near Loch Ness, a Thai monk shared a simple truth. Karma isn't only what happens to us. It's how we respond that shapes our path. Callum stopped trying to find someone to fix him. He stopped seeing himself as a victim. Instead, he practiced compassion, not only for others, but for the version of himself that had once caused harm. He wrote unsent letters to Eleanor. He whispered apologies into the wind. And most importantly, he stopped running. An ending that wasn't a fairy tale, but was enough. A year after that breakthrough, Callum met a woman named Maëlle, a social worker from Marseille. Their love didn't begin with fire and passion. It arrived like a quiet stream, after long and winding paths, flowing gently toward one another. For the first time, Callum wasn't afraid. He didn't rush to impress, didn't panic at silence, didn't hold his breath waiting to be abandoned. He simply was. Present, honest, open, and for that, he was loved. A subtle awakening. Callum's story reminds us that karmic patterns may not always make sense in this lifetime. Sometimes we suffer not for what we remember, but for what we've forgotten. But if we can stay still long enough, if we dare to look within with clarity and compassion, the answers rise, not to shame us, but to free us. As the Buddha once taught, he who does not understand karma will be like a fish in turbulent waters. But he who understands karma learns to swim upstream toward stillness. Story 17. The One Who Stole the Light. In New York, amidst shimmering skyscrapers, lived a woman named Amelia Walsh, a brilliant creative professional in the media industry. She had graduated from one of the top art schools and consistently came up with groundbreaking ideas for her company. Yet strangely, throughout her career, she was rarely given proper credit for her work. Her colleagues, from managers to teammates, constantly managed to stand in her light, sometimes quite literally. They would take her ideas, tweak them just slightly, and then present them as their own. At first, Amelia blamed her lack of assertiveness. She tried to speak up, but every time she did, she was either ostracized, labeled difficult to work with, or quietly pushed aside. She changed companies 3 times and switched teams 4 times. But the pattern followed her everywhere. She began to doubt herself. Then life itself. Was the universe playing tricks on her? She couldn't find a reason. Each time she watched a colleague being praised for something she had crafted, her heart ached, not out of envy, but from a deep sense of helplessness. What did I do wrong to deserve this? For 15 years. This question haunted her until she attended a 10-day meditation retreat in the quiet mountains of Vermont. There were no screens, no emails, no one to steal her light, only breath and silence. On the 7th day, when her mind had finally quieted, Amelia saw a vivid image flash in her awareness. Not a dream, not imagination. She saw herself in another life. A man in a Renaissance cloak stood in a candlelit chamber, presenting a musical score to a royal court. But the melody wasn't his. In the next vision, he entered a small room where a young musician was playing the piano and writing music. He took the young man's composition, changed a few details, and presented it as his own. A deep wave of guilt surged up, not from her current self, but from a place much older. A memory of consciousness rather than personality. When Amelia returned from the retreat, the anger she used to carry was gone. In its place was clarity. She no longer fought every time someone tried to take credit. She acknowledged it but stopped clinging to the need to own the light. She realized the only thing she could control was her own inner response. Then, almost magically, the following year she was invited to become the creative director of a global nonprofit, a space where true value was prioritized over ego. There, people shared the light instead of competing for it. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Amelia felt the light naturally return to her, not through force or assertion, but because she no longer needed to prove anything. Sometimes, what repeats in life is not a sign of failure or misfortune, but a trace of unhealed energy within us. The Buddha taught that karma is not just action, but also intention and mental pattern. Karma is the imprint of all we've ever sown, whether or not we remember. In Amelia's case, she had once stolen another's light in a past life, and in this one, her own light was always taken, not as punishment, but as remembrance. When we end a karmic cycle through awareness, by not reacting, not blaming, we begin to rewrite the script. And when we no longer feel the need to cling to the light, it finds its way back to us. Effortlessly. Part 12. Karma waits for no one, and always arrives on time. Story 18. The Scam That Came Back After 40 Years. New Jersey, 1970s. Robert Klein, a young man from a working-class family. During a small business venture with his friend Michael, he was given his first real test of conscience. The two pooled their modest savings to start a small machinery business. But as soon as the venture began to make money, Robert quietly forged financial documents, manipulated the books, and deceived Michael into believing the business was failing. Michael, disheartened, pulled out with nothing. Robert, meanwhile, took the remaining profits and went on to expand the business alone. No one found out. No one questioned him. And Robert believed he had won. It's just the way the game works, he told himself. If I hadn't done it, someone else would have done it to me. That moment of betrayal became a stepping stone. Robert launched his own company, which flourished. He became a millionaire, a respected entrepreneur, a sought-after speaker. Success rewrote his story, or so he thought. What Robert didn't realize was this. Karma doesn't need an audience. It only needs the right time. 40 years later, karma knocks. At 62, Robert was running a multinational software company with offices in 3 countries. It was during this time that he was approached by a promising young entrepreneur named Liam, who pitched an ambitious AI startup. After careful discussions, legal contracts, and board meetings, Robert invested nearly his entire retirement savings, over $8 million, into the project. Within 6 months, the startup collapsed. Liam disappeared. All the data was wiped. The investment was unrecoverable. Robert was in disbelief. His lawyers investigated and discovered that although all the paperwork was technically legal, every projection, every figure. This is exactly what I did to Michael. He wasn't just scammed. He was scammed in the exact same way, after 40 years of success. At the very age when he hoped to retire peacefully, karma returned, quiet, precise, and unflinching. When karma strikes, without judgment, some events in life defy ordinary explanation. People call it misfortune, bad timing, or simply the cost of taking risks. But when something happens not just similarly, but identically, to what we once did to someone else, it forces us to pause. After the scandal, Robert sought refuge in silence. He traveled briefly, away from business, and visited a small monastery. There, during a quiet afternoon, he confided in an elderly monk, telling the full story of what he once did to Michael, a memory he had buried for decades. The monk simply nodded and said, "What hasn't been repaid doesn't disappear. It waits and returns at the right time." Buddhist teachings and the law of cause and effect. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha says, though a wrong deed may not bring results immediately, it follows the doer like a shadow. When the time is right, the fruit will ripen. Karma isn't punishment. It is more like a seed planted in the ground. You cannot force it to sprout, nor can you bury it deep enough to escape it. It will surface when the conditions are right, no sooner, no later. Robert was not an evil man. He had donated generously, mentored young people, and done good things in life. But that one act, robbing a friend of trust and livelihood, remained unbalanced. When the fruit finally ripened, it didn't just take his money. It asked him to see. If you've ever done something wrong, don't live in fear. But also, don't forget. The point of karma is not to scare us. It is to help us understand that every thought, every action, sends a ripple into time. If you want to free yourself, the answer isn't to outrun karma. It's to live consciously, kindly, and mindfully from this moment forward. Sometimes karma doesn't return in the way we expect. It doesn't always come from the person we wronged. It doesn't always come in the same lifetime. But when it comes with perfect clarity, not to punish, but to awaken. Story 19. The Cost of Silent Wealth. In the sleepy coastal town of Monterey, California, where waves whisper against the cliffs and pelicans skim the silver horizon, there lived a man named Arthur Sullivan, once a powerful figure in the state's Urban Development Board. Arthur had long since retired. He was now 71, white-haired, with skin bronzed by years of sailing, and a mind dulled, not by age, but by silence. The media had never caught wind of the backdoor deals he made in his prime. The lavish villas funded by consultation fees, the discreet offshore accounts opened under shell corporations in Belize, and the quiet exchanges of favors that moved millions of public dollars into private hands. All had been buried beneath layers of technical legality. Arthur was no thief, he told himself, just a man who took the shortcuts that others refused to take. After retirement, He withdrew from public life and moved to his cliffside estate. To the neighbors, he was nothing more than a charming widower with a well-tended garden and a golden retriever named Max. No one asked questions. No one looked deeper. Not anymore. His daughter, Melissa Sullivan, was a different story. Bright, ambitious, and tech-savvy, Melissa had founded a cryptocurrency startup in her 20s that promised to revolutionize ethical investing. She carried herself with the elegance of inherited money and the intellect of Harvard degrees. Few knew that her initial seed funding came from accounts Arthur had opened for her years ago, accounts that quietly transferred money earned from bribes, land zoning manipulations, and tax loopholes. The origin of the money had never been discussed between father and daughter. Some things remained unspoken, like family secrets and moral debts. Melissa's startup boomed. By 34, she was a multimillionaire. Her company sponsored green tech conventions, donated to climate charities, and she spoke often about restoring economic justice in the age of digital assets. The press loved her, until one day, it all unraveled. The investigation began quietly, just a few inquiries from the SEC into suspicious wallet transactions. Then subpoenas. Then a leaked internal email showing falsified smart contracts and siphoned funds. Her top engineer turned whistleblower. The FBI followed the digital trail all the way back to the original seed accounts. Within weeks, Melissa was indicted for fraud, money laundering, and crypto manipulation. Her face, once celebrated on tech magazines, was now splashed across headlines as the symbol of Silicon Valley hypocrisy. Her assets were frozen, properties seized, sponsors pulled out overnight. And one of those frozen accounts? It led straight back to Arthur Sullivan's original offshore fund. He watched the news coverage alone, in his study, a lukewarm cup of tea trembling in his hands. The home he had built with shadow money now felt like a museum of consequences. He tried to call Melissa, but she wouldn't answer. His lawyers advised silence. Anything you say can be used against her, they warned. In the stillness of that night, Arthur walked to the edge of his cliffside balcony and looked out over the black ocean. It didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a mirror. You may leave the battlefield, but karma never forgets your scent. In Buddhist thought, karma is not a ledger of punishment or reward. It is the gentle but precise unfolding of cause and effect. You plant a seed, not always knowing when or where it will bloom, but bloom it will. Not necessarily in your field, but perhaps in your children's. Or theirs. Arthur thought he had escaped consequence. That because the justice system hadn't caught him, karma hadn't either. But karma doesn't operate on court schedules. It doesn't knock on the door in the form of a badge. Sometimes it visits wearing the face of someone you love, and cracks open what you had sealed shut. What made this more haunting wasn't just that Melissa had fallen, it was how. She had been taken down by the very structures Arthur had once abused. Financial manipulation, obscure tax shelters, ill-gotten capital made to look clean. The cycle hadn't skipped a generation. It had come back refined, digital, and viral. In the months that followed, Arthur sold his estate and moved into a modest condo by the bay. He declined all media interviews. Declined to comment when approached by prosecutors. Declined, even, to defend himself. It wasn't guilt, it was recognition. He started volunteering at a Buddhist center not far from his home. Sweeping leaves, washing bowls, learning silence in a new way. One morning, a young monk asked him, "Why do you always clean the same bench every day?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Because that's where I used to sit and pretend the world owed me nothing. I didn't know I was still collecting debts." Karma never rushes. It simply waits for the precise moment when the lesson will be understood. And sometimes, that moment doesn't come through punishment, but through heartbreak. Sometimes, the most painful karma is not what happens to us, but what happens to those we love because of who we were. Part 13. Forgiveness and Transformation, when karma no longer needs to be carried. Story 20. A man who once lived recklessly and went to prison, but after years of spiritual practice and charity work, became a source of inspiration. In a small southern Italian town called Matera, where ancient stone cliffs hold time like breath held in silence, lived a man named Luca Moretti. He was born into a family of modest means, but money was never the issue. The real absence in his childhood was love. His father, a harsh former soldier, used fists instead of words to teach. His mother was so quiet it was as if she had forgotten how to speak. Luca grew up like a storm, wild, angry, and constantly feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. At 17, he dropped out of school and drifted through the streets, quickly becoming entangled in small-time drug circles. It wasn't that he was a bad person, he simply didn't know how to be good. When no one teaches you how to love, it's easy to believe that hurt is all there is. At 22, Luca was caught during a drug trafficking run and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Life behind bars was a repetitive blur, where people seemed frozen inside their mistakes. But in prison, something unexpected happened. Luca met a Buddhist monk named Ajahn Precha, a Thai teacher who had come to Italy to offer meditation to inmates as part of a mindfulness rehabilitation program. At first, Luca scoffed at things like meditation and letting go. But one night, after a terrifying nightmare, reliving the death of a close friend during a failed deal, he woke up in sweat and despair. In that moment of vulnerability, he sought out Ajahn Precha. "How do you forget the past?" Luca asked. The old monk looked at him, said nothing for a while, then invited him to sit. "You don't need to forget," he said. "You just need to see it with new eyes." From that day on, Luca began learning how to sit still, a simple act that proved harder than any fight he had ever been in. He learned to follow his breath, to write his thoughts in a journal, and, for the first time, began writing letters of apology to his parents, though he never sent them. By age 30, when he was released from prison, no one was waiting for him. No job, no home, no friends. But he had one thing, the habit of meditating each morning. He took small jobs, construction, kitchen assistant, street cleaner. Quiet, consistent, without complaint. Each night, he wrote in his journal, not to dwell on sorrow, but to record each day that he was no longer his old self. By chance, he later met Ajahn Preacher again at a community retreat in Rome. The old monk, his hair grayer now, embraced him without words. Luca wept. It was the first time he cried not out of regret, but from gratitude. Soon after, Luca began volunteering to speak at local schools and rehab centers. At first, people were skeptical, but when he shared, "I used to be imprisoned by my own self," walls began to break. People listened not because he was wise, but because he was honest. He didn't preach. He simply stood there as living proof that karma doesn't have to be a life sentence, if we're willing to transform it. Now, at 47, Luca is neither a monk nor a rich man, but he is someone that lost young men turn to, not to be rescued, but to be reminded of who they could become. Once, someone asked him, "Aren't you afraid your past karma will come back to haunt you?" He smiled gently. "I've met it already. It looks at me from the mirror every morning. But now, I no longer fight it. I invite it to sit with me and have tea." The Buddha once taught, karma is action, and action can change when the mind has changed. No one keeps us chained to our past, except ourselves. Forgiveness is not just a gift to others. It's a key to free ourselves from a sentence we've already served long enough. Story 21. A mother once abandoned her child. Years later, after realizing her mistake and sincerely repenting, her child forgave her and returned. In the quiet outskirts of southern Spain, there lived a woman named Isabella. She carried a past she had spent years trying to avoid. As a young woman, Isabella had been ambitious and spirited. She fell into a relationship with a much older man, and when she discovered she was pregnant, fear overwhelmed her. After a series of conflicts with her conservative family, she made a decision that would haunt her for decades. She left her newborn son at the doorstep of a small monastery and vanished from the town without leaving a note. The boy, Matteo, was taken in and raised by the kind nuns of the convent. Though he grew up with a deep sense of gratitude, he carried with him an unanswered question: why did my mother leave me? Meanwhile, Isabella started a new life in Seville. She became a successful interior designer and later remarried, but her heart was never fully at peace. Every time she heard a baby cry or saw a child in the streets, memories came rushing back. When Isabella was 50, her husband passed away in a tragic accident. It was then that the long-buried grief could no longer be suppressed. She gradually withdrew from the world and began attending meditation retreats in Granada. Slowly, she learned to sit with the shadows inside her. During a silent retreat, under the ancient olive trees one early morning, she broke down in tears. There was no longer any justification, just a broken heart and a longing to say, "I'm sorry." Determined to seek redemption, she began searching for the son she had left behind. With the help of a nonprofit organization, she discovered that Matteo had migrated to Canada and was now working in public health. Isabella began writing letters, more than 20 of them. Each one shared a piece of the truth, a piece of her remorse. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only for him to know that she had made a terrible mistake and never stopped thinking of him. At first, Matteo didn't respond. Months passed in silence. The wound of being abandoned ran deep, and healing was no simple matter. But one night, while working a late shift at the hospital, Matteo tended to an elderly homeless woman. Just before she passed, she held his hand and whispered, "You are lucky. Your mother came back to find you." Her words struck something deep within him, like a bell ringing in a forgotten corner of the heart. Weeks later, Matteo returned to Spain. When he saw his mother for the first time in over 30 years, neither spoke. They simply embraced and wept. There were no accusations, no punishment. Time had done enough of that. They didn't try to pretend they were suddenly the perfect mother and son, but they began taking walks together, cooking together, planting a small garden. What had been lost could never be fully recovered, but what remained could be nurtured. The Buddha once taught, "There is no fire like hatred and no burden heavier than resentment." Forgiveness is not a gift we give others. It is a door we open for ourselves to allow peace to return. Isabella had once planted a seed of deep suffering, but over time, she also sowed the seed of remorse and compassion. And when that seed grew, it didn't erase the past, but it allowed two human hearts to find each other again, across all that once seemed impossible. This, too, is how karma sometimes works, not just to punish, but to awaken, to transform, to invite return. Karma isn't to be feared, but to be understood. Throughout the past 13 parts, we've journeyed through lives that couldn't be more different, from the distant mother left in a nursing home, the deceitful boss, the girl who cursed her ex, to the convict who became a source of light. Each story has been like a mirror, reflecting pieces of humanity that live quietly within each of us. But if we look closely, there is a tender and mysterious truth that threads through them all. Karma doesn't come to punish, it comes to guide. In the Buddhist teaching, karma is not a sentence. It is the natural connection between cause and effect, just like seed and fruit, shadow and form. If you plant a bitter seed, you cannot expect to grow a sweet tree. But if you have once sown something bitter, you can still choose to plant something else, something healing, today. Life is not always fair in the ways people want, but it is always balanced in the way the universe needs. Sometimes, a person helps another only to be betrayed in return. Sometimes, it takes another lifetime for a kind thought to bear fruit. Sometimes, karma doesn't return to us directly, but finds its way through those closest to us, like an echo of choices once made. And yet, through it all, one truth never changes. Karma can be transformed. This is the real heart of every story we've told. A betrayer can become someone who loves sincerely. A man who hurt his parents can awaken through the same pain, now returned by his own child. A lifelong deceiver may learn that no wealth can buy forgiveness. And a mother who once abandoned her child may still one day be embraced, if her remorse is true, and her heart has softened. This means that karma is not a prison, but a path home. Everyone has a chance, but it doesn't come through begging for mercy. It comes through living differently, day by day, act by act, thought by thought. Because in Buddhism, karma isn't only in what we do, it lives in how we think, how we see, and how we walk through the world. A careless word, a fleeting thought, they all plant seeds in the deeper currents of our life stream. So the important question isn't, what did I do wrong in the past? It's, what am I planting right now? If you plant understanding, you will reap understanding. If you plant compassion, you will meet compassion. If you plant forgiveness, peace will find you. Have you ever done something, just a small thing, and years later, something else happens, seemingly unrelated, but it leaves you with a chill down your spine? Like it might be karma? Maybe it was a harmless lie, a simple act of kindness, a selfish choice no one saw. But somehow, the universe kept the receipt. No camera, no witness, just you, and that moment. A boy who used to tease stray cats later grew up to lose sight in one eye after a random scratch. A student who mocked his classmate for being poor ended up watching his own son get bullied years later for wearing secondhand clothes. A woman who once helped an old man during a storm had her daughter's